Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and chaotic bedchambers of some medieval queens. Women who redefined scandal long before tabloids. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Joanna I of Naples was crowned in 1343, and almost immediately decided that royal protocol was more of a suggestion than a rule. Where others saw tradition, she saw opportunity, and where others saw one husband, she saw several. She married 4 times, which in medieval noble circles wasn't that unusual, except Joanna made a bit of a habit of outliving her husbands, sometimes suspiciously quickly. Her first, Andrew of Hungary, didn't make it out of year 1. He was found hanging from a window in what was officially labelled an unfortunate accident. Unofficially, people had questions. Joanna had none. Now, there's a particular legend that gives Joanna her infamous reputation. It's said she had a trapdoor built beneath her bed, a rather creative solution for ending a date when words just wouldn't do. After a night of royal intimacy, the floor would allegedly open beneath her partner, sending him tumbling into the castle moat. Efficient, dramatic, and quite possibly made up by a very bitter ex. Still, the story stuck. Probably because it fits her vibe. Joanna ruled Naples with elegance and a certain theatrical flair. She wasn't reckless, just selective. Some called her charming, others called her dangerous. A few called her both while backing slowly out of the room. She held her own through wars, papal outrage, political rivals, and more than a few bedroom scandals. And through it all, she wore her crown like she wore her reputation, boldly and without apology. By the time she died, strangled, possibly by one of her many enemies, or allies, it's hard to tell, Joanna had left behind a legacy of drama, power, and enough gossip to keep Italian ballads going for centuries. Joanna of Naples wasn't just a queen. She was a headline, long before headlines existed. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just live in the 12th century. She ran it. Queen of France, then Queen of England, and at one point mother of 2 future kings, Eleanor didn't so much play the Game of Thrones as flip the board, drink the wine, and write a sonnet about it. She married Louis VII of France at 15. He was deeply pious, painfully awkward, and gave off strong, married his cousin because he had no other hobbies energy. Eleanor, on the other hand, was witty, wealthy, and had the attention span of a falcon in heat. The marriage worked about as well as you'd expect. Louis dragged her on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land, a romantic getaway if you enjoy marching through deserts in full armour and watching your husband cry at relics. Eleanor brought fine clothes, musicians, and possibly a soft spot for her handsome uncle, the Prince of Antioch. Rumours swirled. Louis frowned a lot. The marriage died quietly over a cold supper in Damascus. After the annulment, Eleanor practically sprinted back to Aquitaine and remarried, this time to Henry Plantagenet, the future King of England. He was 11 years younger, red-haired, and wildly unpredictable. In short, her type. Their marriage produced 10 children, multiple wars, and one of the most passive-aggressive households in European history. But Eleanor wasn't just birthing future monarchs. She was holding poetry contests. At her court in Poitiers, she championed courtly love, a new genre that encouraged noble ladies to be adored from afar by hopeless knights with emotional problems and good cheekbones. Of course, no one followed the from afar part. It was all stolen glances, lute playing, and long walks that ended behind tapestries. Eleanor's court became the go-to destination for nobles with more passion than impulse control. When Henry's wandering eye got tired of monogamy, and of Eleanor, she responded the way any good mother would, by helping her sons stage a full rebellion against him. He was not amused. She was placed under castle arrest for 16 years, which for Eleanor just meant more time to write letters, sip wine, and plot vengeance through her children. Margaret of Burgundy wasn't the kind of queen you'd expect to cause a national scandal. She ticked all the right boxes: royal bloodline, properly married to the heir of France, looked great in fur-trimmed gowns, and didn't openly poison anyone at court dinners. A model medieval wife, on paper. But then came the year 1314, when France discovered that keeping 3 princesses bored and unsupervised in a castle was a recipe for gossip, embroidery, and extramarital activities. Margaret was married to Louis, future King Louis X, a man whose charisma was often compared to boiled cabbage. Their marriage was not what you'd call thrilling, and Margaret, apparently, got tired of reading psalms and pretending Louis's bedtime stories about tax reform were seductive. Enter the Tour de Nesle affair, a scandal with a name so dramatic it sounds like a medieval soap opera. According to the accounts, Margaret and her sister-in-law Blanche started meeting 2 handsome Norman knights in secret. Where, you ask? In the Tour de Nesle, a royal tower by the Seine, conveniently private, mildly haunted, and apparently soundproof enough for courtly whispers and less than courtly behaviour. The men were eventually caught because, and this is real, they were recognised by the pattern on their pillowcases. Royal servants noticed the knights had luxury linens identical to those used in the princesses' chambers. That's right. The downfall of a queen was triggered by medieval pillow theft. No espionage, no poison, just bad laundry choices. King Philip IV, Margaret's father-in-law and reigning monarch, was not amused. The knights were tortured and executed, publicly and with dramatic flair. As for Margaret, she was thrown into prison at Château Gaillard, a place about as cheerful as its name isn't. She died there 2 years later, either from illness, suffocation, or the fact that her husband wanted a clean slate before becoming king. Medieval history is fuzzy on the details, and suspiciously quiet about whether the pillowcases were returned. Margaret's crime wasn't politics, witchcraft, or treason. It was being a little too charming in the wrong tower, with the wrong men, on the wrong linens. And in medieval France, that was enough to get you erased. Isabella of France had everything a medieval queen could want: royal blood, a crown, expensive French shoes, and a husband she couldn't stand. She married Edward II of England in 1308. He was tall, handsome, and more emotionally available to his male favourites than to his wife, which, in a royal marriage, was complicated. From the beginning, Isabella had competition. Edward was already very attached to one Piers Gaveston, a charming knight with a flair for fashion and the political tact of a fruit bat. Edward gave him titles, land, and the kind of attention most wives had to work years to get. At the coronation banquet, Gaveston wore more jewels than Isabella. She noticed. Gaveston was eventually exiled, recalled, exiled again, and then beheaded by annoyed nobles who were deeply unimpressed with his eyeliner and smugness. Isabella might have shed a royal tear. Or not. But just when you think the marital drama peaked, Edward replaced Gaveston with Hugh Despencer, a man so greedy and unpopular he made Gaveston look like a picnic. Despencer wasn't just in the king's bedchamber, he was in the treasury, the council, and every single noble's bad dreams. He exiled Isabella's allies, seized her lands, and insulted her in public. Bold strategy, insulting the queen, historically unwise. By 1326, Isabella had had enough. She took her son, the future Edward III, and fled to France under the pretence of diplomacy. There she met Roger Mortimer, a nobleman with a rebellious streak, strong jawline, and a very available marriage status. Together, Isabella and Mortimer launched a full invasion of England. Yes, really. The Queen invaded her own country with a boyfriend and a teenage son in tow. It worked. Edward was captured and deposed. And then the rumours started. Edward II died in prison under mysterious circumstances. One particularly graphic rumour suggests a red-hot poker was involved. Most historians now consider that an exaggeration, but still, Isabella's hands were not exactly clean. She ruled England as regent for several years, sharing power, and probably blankets, with Mortimer, until her son got tired of watching and overthrew them both. Isabella was sent to a comfortable retirement, because even a rebellious queen needs a break eventually. She entered as a wife, she left as a legend. Agnes of Navarre was born into poetry, politics, and passive-aggressive dynasties. As the daughter of a king and sister to a troubadour queen, she was raised in a world where words were sharp, alliances sharper, and a well-placed romantic affair could fix almost anything, or ruin everything. She became Queen of Aragon through marriage to King James II's grandson, which sounds nice until you realise her new husband, James IV, was already halfway to lunacy. And not the fun, artistic kind, more like the wakes up screaming and accuses the curtains of treason kind. Agnes responded to this situation the way any self-respecting medieval noblewoman with no options would, by turning her affections elsewhere, quietly, repeatedly, and with an apparent eye for variety. Her list of alleged lovers included knights, courtiers, musicians, and possibly a monk who was terrible at vows. She was charming, cultured, and fluent in the language of flirtation, which, in the court of Aragon, was more useful than knowing Latin. Probably more dangerous too. Of course, secrets don't stay secret long in castles with stone walls and bored servants. Rumours began to swirl, and before long, her love life was more popular reading than the Psalms. Now, to be clear, Agnes never officially got caught. No public trial, no confession under duress, but people did start dying around her. Quietly, conveniently. A rival here, a gossipy maid there, and one unfortunate courtier who apparently tripped into a very full moat. Was she behind it? We'll never know. But the kitchen staff reportedly started locking the spice cabinets when she passed by, just in case. Eventually her husband died, shockingly not by her hand, and Agnes retired to a convent. Not out of guilt, mind you, just tradition. Convents were where noblewomen went to read, pray, and quietly outlive their scandals. She never remarried, possibly because no one was brave enough to ask, or because she finally found peace among nuns who didn't ask nosy questions. Agnes of Navarre left behind no heirs, but she did leave a legacy, a whisper in court, a rumour in the corridors, and a warning in every love poem that ended too suddenly. Joanna of Castile was a princess by birth, a queen by title, and a walking cautionary tale about getting way too emotionally attached to your spouse. She married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, and no, that wasn't just a nickname. He was actually considered the medieval equivalent of a heartthrob, with flowing blonde hair, impressive calves, and the kind of smirk that suggested he never once did the dishes. Joanna, for all her royal training, fell hard. Theirs was a passionate marriage, until it wasn't. Philip was charming, ambitious, and allergic to monogamy. He cheated constantly. Subtly at first, then with the kind of reckless abandon usually reserved for poorly written romance novels. Joanna, not one to take betrayal lightly, responded with fits of rage, interrogations, and, according to some sources, a few attempts at hair-pulling diplomacy. But things took a strange turn when Philip suddenly dropped dead in 1506, allegedly from drinking cold water after a game of ball. Yes, that was an actual explanation. Even for the 16th century, it was suspiciously vague. Joanna was devastated. Not the usual black veil and move on kind of devastated, the dig up the body and carry it around kind, which she did, for months. She ordered the coffin opened repeatedly to make sure no one had stolen his body. She kissed his dead lips. She even refused to let any women near the corpse, in case they got ideas. Apparently, even in death, Philip was considered a flight risk. Joanna travelled across Castile with the coffin, stopping at monasteries, insisting on sleeping next to it, and according to some rumours, possibly even with it. The chroniclers got vague right around that part. Whether out of respect or sheer discomfort is unclear. People started whispering. Courtiers panicked. Her father, Ferdinand, eventually declared her insane and locked her in a convent for the next 46 years, a record even among emotionally intense queens. Now, was Joanna truly mad? Or just a grief-stricken woman clinging too tightly to the one man who truly let her down? Historians debate it. But either way, she remains one of the few medieval queens known more for her post-mortem romance than for anything she did with the living. First things first. No, Catherine the Great did not die while attempting intimacy with a horse. But the fact that we even have to say that should give you an idea of how wild her reputation became, and how hard the 18th century gossip machine worked overtime once she annoyed the right number of people. Catherine was technically outside our medieval range, but she earns her spot here on sheer scandal density alone. Born a minor German princess, she married into Russian royalty and soon realized that her husband, Peter III, was less a Tsar and more of a grown child with military toys and a concerning fondness for Prussia. He preferred playing soldiers to running an empire, or frankly, spending time with his wife. So Catherine, as any ambitious woman in an ice-cold marriage might, looked elsewhere. She took lovers, many lovers, officers, nobles, poets, possibly a furniture maker. Some were younger, some were terrifyingly competent. One was 18 when she was 60, which, honestly, is less scandalous and more motivational if you think about it. But Catherine wasn't reckless. She was calculating. She rewarded her lovers with estates and titles, a kind of royal loyalty program. Impress the empress, and you walked away with land and maybe a nice pension. Fail to impress? Well, there's always exile. Now back to that rumour. Sometime after her death, malicious enemies or very bored aristocrats spread the tale that Catherine died while attempting intimate relations with a horse. The rumour was so absurd, so anatomically implausible, that it should have died immediately. It didn't. Why? Because Catherine was a powerful woman who ruled without a man. She made reforms, crushed rebellions, and told the church to mind its own business. So, naturally, the only way people could handle that was to invent a story involving livestock and architecture. In reality, she died of a stroke, in bed, fully clothed, with no livestock present. But the damage was done. The myth lived on, because people love scandal more than truth. And Catherine, who was already scandalous enough in life, became downright legendary in death. She may not have slept with a horse, but she absolutely rode history like she owned it. If you thought medieval queens just sat around doing embroidery and sighing by candlelight, allow us to introduce Fredegund of Neustria, a woman who believed strongly in marital duty, royal dignity, and stabbing her enemies in the neck. Born a servant, Fredegund rose through the ranks with the kind of efficiency that usually requires either extreme charisma or a body count. In her case, it was both. She caught the eye of King Chilperic I of Neustria, a Frankish king who already had a wife. But not for long. His first queen mysteriously died shortly after Fredegund entered the scene. Shocking, truly. The second wife, Galsvintha, was found strangled in her bed not long after marrying Chilperic. Fredegund, by then firmly in the king's favour, denied involvement, repeatedly, with that classic, "I may be holding a pillow, but that doesn't prove anything" tone. Once married to Chilperic herself, Fredegund didn't calm down. She escalated, like a lot. She was known for keeping a knife under her pillow, not symbolically, literally. This was a woman who treated bedtime like a potential crime scene. Political rival? Poisoned. Bishop says something rude? Disappears mysteriously. Servant gets too gossipy? Oops, dead again. Her feud with Brunhilde of Austrasia, her sister-in-law, became the stuff of legend. The two women spent decades waging what was essentially a royal mean girls' war, but with more assassinations. Fredegund once sent a hired killer to murder Brunhilde's son during Mass. Subtlety was not her strong suit. Even after her husband's own very suspicious assassination, Fredegund ruled as regent for her son, Clothar II. She handled diplomacy, crushed rebellions, and probably stabbed at least one more person during a dinner party. She wasn't just feared, she was respected, mostly out of fear, and yet somehow she died peacefully in bed, which feels like a clerical error in the grand script of her life. Fredegund didn't just sleep with knives, she was the knife, sharp, cold, and always ready. She makes most other queens on this list look like they were playing with wooden spoons. Anne Boleyn wasn't born to be queen. She was born to be noticed. Smart, stylish, and fluent in the delicate art of eyebrow archery, she knew how to command attention in a room full of powdered men who thought Latin made them irresistible. She showed up at the English court in the early 1500s like a fashionable storm, not conventionally beautiful according to some accounts, but magnetic in that "I'm smarter than you and I know it" kind of way. King Henry VIII took one look at her and promptly forgot he already had a wife. Unfortunately for Queen Catherine of Aragon, Anne wasn't interested in just being the king's mistress. She aimed higher, like crown-level higher. Henry pursued her for years, wrote love letters that were equal parts obsession and teenage diary, and tore the country in half just to marry her, literally. He created the Church of England so he could annul his marriage and slide a ring onto Anne's very ambitious finger. That's not romance. That's state-sponsored seduction. Once queen, Anne Boleyn was not content to sit quietly and pop out airs. She was sharp-tongued, opinionated, and openly disliked by half the court, mostly because she said what she thought and didn't faint at flattery. She also had a habit of teasing Henry in public, which, while amusing, was a bold move considering his track record with wives. And then came the problem: no son. Just one daughter, Elizabeth, who would later rule England like a boss, but at the time was a major disappointment to a king obsessed with male heirs. Suddenly, Anne's flirtatious charm wasn't charming anymore. Rumours started. Affairs with courtiers, incest with her brother, witchcraft, adultery. Most of it was absurd, even by Tudor standards. But Henry was bored and looking for an exit, preferably one with a blade. She was arrested, given a trial that would have made a kangaroo blush, and executed by a French swordsman specially imported for the occasion. Because if you're going to murder your wife, at least be classy about it. Anne Boleyn lost her head, but not her legacy. She remains the queen who played the long game, won the throne, and lost everything. All because she dared to say no before she said yes. Some queens rise through scandal, some through seduction. And then there's Christina of Denmark, who rose through self-preservation and the ability to deliver a verbal slap without smudging her lipstick. She was born into Danish royalty in 1521 and married off young. Standard procedure in the 16th century, where teenage girls were basically walking diplomatic treaties in velvet gowns. Her husband, the Duke of Milan, died shortly after, leaving Christina a widow at age 16, which, for a noblewoman, was kind of the dream. Wealth, independence, and nobody trying to explain taxes to you over dinner. Enter Henry VIII, recently single, extremely impatient, and already one wife down. Anne Boleyn was still cooling off, so to speak. Naturally, he sent a portrait painter to capture Christina's likeness and assess her suitability. And Christina, being politically savvy, and not at all eager to become wife number 3, or target number 3, looked at the proposal and famously replied, "If I had 2 heads, I would happily put one at the disposal of the King of England." That's not just a rejection. That's a roast that should be carved into marble. Henry was reportedly not amused. He still pursued her for a while, because nothing says romance like ignoring a diplomatic insult and pushing forward with marriage negotiations anyway. Christina, however, remained firmly unenthusiastic, possibly because she enjoyed breathing. Instead of becoming Queen of England and possible execution number 3, Christina chose a much safer route, marrying a duke who didn't behead people over breakfast. She lived comfortably, ruled wisely, and kept her neck attached for the rest of her life, which, historically speaking, is a win. She later acted as a regent, dabbled in military strategy, and continued to collect portraits, because sometimes it's nice to be admired without a proposal from a man with a sword fetish. Christina never made it to the English throne, but her quote became legendary. She's proof that sometimes the most powerful move isn't taking the crown, it's dodging it entirely, preferably while delivering a line so cutting it leaves historians giggling 500 years later. Maria of Portugal started her royal journey like many noble women of her time, reluctantly married to a man twice her age, expected to smile politely, and ideally produce an heir without asking too many questions. She married Alfonso XI of Castile, a king with battlefield glory, an ego the size of Toledo, and a mistress he openly preferred. Not just behind closed doors. He flaunted his lover, Leonor de Guzman, like a trophy wife with a better backstory. Maria, understandably, was less than thrilled. She gave him a legitimate heir, the future Peter the Cruel, while Leonor gave him 10 illegitimate ones, and got most of the royal affection, perks, and housing benefits. After Alfonso's death, Maria finally got her moment. She returned to Portugal with her teenage son, Peter, and did what any bitter, sidelined queen might do, obsessively cling to her boy like he was both emotional support and revenge strategy. Historians politely call it overprotective. The less polite ones raise their eyebrows and point to the strange intensity of their relationship. Peter grew up, fell in love, and married his longtime mistress, Inez de Castro. Maria did not approve. Some say it was because Inez was of lower nobility. Others say it was because she didn't want to share Peter with any woman who wasn't Maria herself. Either way, things escalated fast. According to one dramatic version of events, Maria encouraged Inez's assassination, and Peter, after Inez was murdered, responded by declaring her his wife posthumously, digging up her body, placing it on the throne, and forcing nobles to kiss her rotting hand. You know, a completely measured royal response. Did Maria actually mastermind the killing? Maybe. Maybe not. But her name was definitely whispered behind palace curtains for years. Later in life, she withdrew from politics and may or may not have started referring to herself as Empress in private. There's no proof she went fully mad, but she did spend a lot of time staring out windows and writing letters no one read. Maria of Portugal never got the love she wanted, but she did get a lifetime of palace intrigue, gossip, and the dubious honour of being remembered as the mother-in-law from medieval hell. Olga of Kiev was not a woman to cross lightly, or at all, or even look at funny. When her husband, Prince Igor, was murdered by a neighbouring tribe called the Drevlians in 945, they made a critical mistake. They assumed his widow would quietly mourn, and then accept a marriage proposal from the Drevlian prince, as if the woman whose husband they just tied to trees and ripped in half would be in the mood for wedding cake. Olga smiled, nodded politely, and told them she'd consider it. Then she burned them all. First, she invited the Drevlian envoys to her court. While they relaxed in their boats, she had them carried, boats and all, into a massive pit and buried alive. A strong opening move. Then she sent word to the Drevlians to send more noble suitors. When those arrived, she offered them a bathhouse to freshen up before meeting her. Once they were inside, she locked the doors and set the place on fire. Still not done, she travelled to the Drevlian capital, asking for a funeral feast in honour of her late husband. They threw a massive party. She got them drunk, and then her soldiers killed around 5,000 of them. It was less a feast, and more of a blood-splattered TED talk on why you don't mess with widows from Kiev. But the pièce de résistance? The birds. When the Drevlians finally retreated and begged for mercy, Olga told them she'd stop the siege if each household gave her 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows. Reasonable, they thought. Humane, even. Olga then tied sulphur-soaked cloth to each bird's leg, lit them on fire, and released them. The birds naturally flew home, into barns, thatched roofs, and wooden homes. The entire city burned down in a single synchronized firestorm, all brought to you by Team Avian Vengeance. Olga eventually converted to Christianity, and is now a canonized saint, proving that even history has a sense of humour. One minute you're burning cities with pigeons, the next you're a holy symbol of piety and wisdom. Olga didn't flirt, poison or plot in whispers. She just annihilated. And somehow, she still made the sainthood list. Lucrezia Borgia never technically wore a queen's crown, but don't let that fool you. She ruled hearts, bedrooms, and suspiciously timed deaths with more flair than most monarchs could manage with a full treasury and a standing army. Born in 1480 to the Borgia family, which is already a red flag, Lucrezia was the daughter of Pope Alexander VI. Yes, Pope. You'd think a celibate man of God wouldn't have children, but the Borgias operated under their own interpretation of scripture, mostly involving nepotism and Renaissance-level thirst. Lucrezia was married off several times as part of political alliances. Husbands tended to either die suddenly, flee in fear, or find themselves in awkward situations involving mysterious circumstances. One poor soul, Giovanni Sforza, claimed he was pressured to annul their marriage due to non-consummation. In other words, the family publicly declared he was too boring in bed for Lucrezia's standards. Subtle, they were not. And then there were the rumours, that she wore a hollow ring filled with poison, that she had an affair with her brother, Cesare, that she gave birth to a child whose parentage was listed as unknown, possibly even the Pope himself. Medieval gossip didn't dabble in subtle implications. It sprinted straight into full-blown soap opera territory. Was any of it true? Probably not. But that didn't stop the whispers. Lucrezia was beautiful, intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, and knew how to throw a party, which, in 15th century Rome, meant orgies, politics, and maybe a little light homicide for flavour. Despite the chaos surrounding her, Lucrezia later settled into a quieter life as Duchess of Ferrara. She ran a successful court, supported the arts, and spent more time reading poetry than plotting murders. It's almost disappointing, like watching a lion take up gardening. But the legend of Lucrezia never died. The Borgia name still drips with scandal, and she remains its most glamorous ghost, equal parts reality and very well-dressed myth. In the end, Lucrezia's greatest weapon wasn't poison or seduction, it was ambiguity, and history, as always, ate it up. Wu Zetian began her imperial career the traditional way, as a teenage concubine to Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. She was one of many, pretty, polite, and quietly observant. She also played the long game like it was a board sport with no rule book. When the emperor died, Wu, like all concubines without children, was sent to a Buddhist convent to live out her days in quiet reflection. Wu reflected, then plotted, then re-emerged. She somehow caught the eye of the next emperor, Taizong's son, Gaozong. Yes, she seduced her former stepson. Yes, that's exactly as awkward as it sounds. She returned to court, this time with upgraded ambitions and significantly fewer illusions about loyalty. Once she became empress, Wu began clearing the imperial court like it was spring cleaning with execution warrants. Rivals, removed, political threats, exiled, framed, or turned into cautionary tales. Even her own children weren't safe. She was rumoured to have smothered her infant daughter just to frame the previous empress. That might sound extreme, but Wu didn't dabble in subtlety. She preferred results. Eventually, when Emperor Gaozong fell ill, Wu ruled through him, around him, and in spite of him. After his death, she made her next bold move, becoming the first and only woman to declare herself Emperor of China in her own right. She didn't rule from behind a veil or through a regent. She sat on the throne, wore the robes, and signed the decrees. The Confucian scholars had a collective breakdown. Wu did not care. Under her reign, the empire thrived. Agriculture improved. Education expanded. The civil service grew. But so did the number of accidental deaths at court and mysteriously silent dissidents. And yes, the rumours followed. Secret lovers, sexual manipulation, murder by golden box, orgies in the palace. You name it, someone accused her of it. A woman in power couldn't possibly be competent, they reasoned. It had to be sex magic. Wu ignored them all. She died in her 80s. Rare for an empress, rarer still for a woman who ruled directly for over 40 years and made it look easy. Queen Tamar of Georgia ruled during what historians call the Georgian Golden Age, but if you believe the court poets, it was also a time of spiritual enlightenment, epic war victories, and extremely poetic pillow talk. Crowned King of Kings, yes, king, in 1184, Tamar wasn't content with being a queen in name only. She styled herself as the sovereign ruler, not just the royal accessory to a husband. And when her nobles tried to saddle her with a politically safe marriage, she politely chose a drunken Russian prince with questionable hygiene, married him, and then promptly exiled him when he misbehaved. Which he did. A lot. After that, Tamar ruled solo. Georgia expanded its territory, flourished economically, and produced so much court poetry it could have flooded the Black Sea with verses about love, loyalty, and the divine glow of our glorious queen's cheekbone. Now here's where things get interesting, and just a little bit spicy. Tamar's court poets, particularly Shota Rustaveli, wrote epic romances so passionately devoted to her that modern scholars have raised an eyebrow or two. His The Knight in the Panther's Skin tells the story of a queen who rules all men, inspires blind devotion, and may or may not resemble Tamar with slightly more metaphor. Of course, none of this proves anything, but rumours do linger that Tamar may have enjoyed more than just literary admiration from the men, and possibly women, at her court. Whispers about private retreats, discreet companions, and late-night conversations that didn't involve state policy float through medieval sources like delicate smoke no one wants to name. Despite the flirtations of history, Tamar was canonized as a saint after her death, which is impressive, considering her reign included leading crusades, crushing rebellions, and allegedly sending ex-lovers off to monasteries for spiritual reflection. She died peacefully, surrounded by loyal nobles, and enough theological justification to make even the most poetic rumours fade quietly into myth. Tamar didn't need scandal to be remembered, but the possibility of one, that's what keeps her fascinating. If you think Christmas ends on December 25th, you'd be laughed out of a medieval tavern. Back then, the real party was only just beginning. In the Middle Ages, Christmas lasted 12 full days, from the Nativity on December 25th all the way to the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th. And each of those 12 days had its own meaning, customs, and excuses for indulgence. The first day, Christmas itself, was solemn and sacred, but don't let the incense fool you. After weeks of Advent, which was basically medieval Lent with fewer snacks and more waiting, Christmas unleashed a flood of feasting, music, and merrymaking. The poor got to eat meat, the rich threw banquets that could bankrupt a small monastery, and the ale, flowing like the Danube. The 12 days weren't just an extended dinner party. They were spiritual, theatrical, and frankly chaotic. Each day had different saints to honour. December 26th was St. Stephen's Day, when people gave food and charity to the poor. Think Proto-Boxing Day, but with more piety and fewer sales. December 28th was Holy Innocents' Day, a commemoration of the children slain by Herod, where some traditions even called for children to rule the household for the day. Yes, the kids were in charge, and that never ends well. By the time January 1st rolled around, the feast of the circumcision, everyone was too full, too drunk, and too tired to do much more than stumble through a Latin hymn and grab another roasted goose leg. But they pushed through to January 6th, Epiphany, which marked the visit of the Magi. That's when the 12th night came into full swing, with masks, disguises, and the kind of role reversal where peasants played kings and kings pretended to enjoy it. For medieval folk, Christmas wasn't a single morning of wrapping paper and sugar crashes. It was a nearly 2-week blend of sacred devotion, rowdy excess, and social topsy-turvy. And if you weren't still partying well into the new year, were you even celebrating? Forget pine trees and plastic Santas. A medieval Christmas looked more like a pagan woodland rave than a cozy Hallmark special. Instead of tinsel, they decorated with ivy, holly, bay leaves, and mistletoe, all evergreen plants symbolizing eternal life, repurposed from earlier pagan winter solstice traditions. If it stayed green in December, it was getting hung on a wall. The real centerpiece, however, was the boar's head, not just as dinner, but as decoration. Picture this: a roasted pig's head with an apple in its mouth, paraded into the great hall on a silver platter, accompanied by minstrels singing the Boar's Head Carol, because nothing says Merry Christmas like a severed pig's face making eye contact with your guests. And speaking of halls, homes weren't cosy little cottages. The nobility celebrated in grand halls that echoed with the sounds of lutes, pipes, and the occasional inebriated monk belting out Christmas hymns. The hall would be strewn with rushes on the floor, the walls adorned with tapestries, and the air filled with the smells of roast goose, spiced wine, and unwashed bodies. Festive. In the absence of Christmas trees, which didn't really catch on in Europe until the early modern period, people got creative. Ivy and holly weren't just tossed around randomly. They were symbolic. Holly, with its sharp leaves, was thought to represent the crown of thorns worn by Christ. Ivy, clinging and twining, symbolized the faithful's dependence on God. It was a theological houseplant arrangement. Mistletoe, on the other hand, was a bit racier. Associated with fertility and Norse myths, it wasn't always church approved, but that didn't stop medieval revelers from hanging it in doorways. If you stood beneath it, tradition dictated you could be kissed, often forcibly. The church didn't love that part, but let's be honest, the medieval church didn't love a lot of things, and people still did them. So if you walked into a medieval manor during Christmas, it would feel part holy sanctuary, part bacchanalian forest feast. Evergreen boughs hanging from the rafters, candles flickering on long wooden tables, roasted meats sweating on trays, and someone trying to remember which corner had the mistletoe and which one had the chamber pot. In the Middle Ages, Christmas feasting wasn't just a nice meal. It was an edible declaration of power, piety, and sheer gluttony. For the nobility, it was an opportunity to show off their wealth through a parade of absurdly over-the-top dishes. For the peasants, it was the one time of year they might get actual meat. Either way, everyone ate like tomorrow was doomsday, which, given the plague and famine situation, wasn't entirely irrational. The star of the show was often the boar's head, yes, again, but that was just the beginning. Roasted peacock served in its own iridescent feathers, swan glazed with spices, pies so large they could hide a live bird, and occasionally did. There were stews thick with root vegetables, half-baked bread, sweetmeats, pottages, and soteltes, elaborate edible sculptures made of marzipan, sugar, or dough, shaped like castles, angels, or dragons. Medieval food wasn't subtle, and let's not forget the drinks. Wassail, a hot, spiced ale or cider, was passed around in communal bowls. The word wassail literally meant be well, or be in good health, but the effect was usually the opposite. Another favourite was hippocras, a spiced wine sweetened with honey and served warm. These drinks weren't just festive, they were functional. After weeks of Advent fasting, your stomach needed a little help handling the tidal wave of goose fat and barley bread. But these feasts weren't casual buffets, they were carefully staged performances. High-status guests were served first and seated closest to the fire. Lower-ranking folk got the scraps, unless you were at a monastery where equality was the rule, but the food was infinitely more boring. Still, even monks broke their vegetarian rules for Christmas. Nothing says baby Jesus is born like a leg of mutton and a jug of wine. Food was central to the medieval Christmas because it was rare to have so much of it. For much of the year, people scraped by on porridge and cabbage. Christmas was the moment the social contract agreed. Yes, let us all get uncomfortably full together. And if you thought one feast was enough, think again. Each of the 12 days had its own meal, its own host, and often its own theme. By the time Epiphany rolled around, most celebrants were spiritually uplifted, emotionally drained, and physically bloated. If you think modern Christmas gets a little chaotic with family drama and overcooked turkey, the Middle Ages said, "Hold my wassail." Enter the Lord of Misrule, a real position, often filled by a fool, a servant, or some mischievous cleric chosen to oversee the Christmas revelries. His job: turn the world upside down and make everything delightfully inappropriate. The Lord of Misrule was the human embodiment of holiday madness. For the duration of the 12 days, he might preside over mock court sessions, where people were tried for ridiculous crimes like stealing sausages or having an ugly hat. His court was filled with jesters, musicians, and other agents of mischief. This was licensed anarchy, wrapped in bells and tinsel. During his reign, hierarchies could be reversed. Servants gave orders. Students punished teachers. Choir boys dressed as bishops. It was part carnival, part spiritual exercise in humility. Medieval people believed that flipping the social order, temporarily, helped reinforce it in the long run. You let off steam for 12 days so the rest of the year could be nice and boring. Even monasteries weren't safe. Some churches elected a boy bishop on December 6th, St. Nicholas Day, who led processions and delivered mock sermons. This wasn't just for laughs, it was symbolic. The child's innocent wisdom was seen as closer to divine truth. Also, it was hilarious to watch a 12-year-old try to pronounce incarnation. The Lord of Misrule also encouraged wild dances, drinking games, and bizarre costumes. In noble courts, people wore animal masks, cross-dressed, or dressed as devils, saints, or biblical figures, often all three in one room. Think of it like medieval Halloween with a Christmas playlist. Of course, the church had mixed feelings. Some clergy tried to rein it in, especially when the festivities got too bawdy. But they also understood that medieval life was hard, and letting people cut loose, within limits, helped keep the peace. Plus, even bishops liked a good fruitcake. So while you might stress over holiday decor or awkward family dinners, remember, medieval people had a designated agent of chaos running the show, and his entire mission was to make Christmas as weird, wild, and upside down as humanly possible. If a group of medieval carolers showed up at your door today, you'd probably call security. Back then, caroling was less about angelic harmonies and more about demanding food and booze in exchange for not making a scene. Picture it: drunken peasants belting out tunes while waving tankards and possibly a goose. The term carol originally meant a circular dance accompanied by singing, and many Christmas carols started as secular folk songs, with lyrics that were occasionally a bit bawdy. Over time, these were adopted, rewritten, or sanitized by the church to reflect more pious themes. But even the most devout carolers knew that singing was only half the tradition. The other half was collecting your reward. Wassailing was the main vehicle for this festive extortion. Groups would go from house to house, singing songs and offering a toast of wassail, hot mulled cider or ale, and in return they expected food, drink, or money. If you didn't cough it up, the carolers might keep singing, louder. Or worse, improvise verses about your stinginess. Yes, they were the medieval version of Yelp reviewers, but with bells. This wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Nobles often had food and drink ready for passing carolers, and peasants saw it as a rare chance to visit their betters and maybe sneak a few meat pies. There was even an air of ritual to it. People believed that welcoming carolers and sharing food brought luck and blessings for the new year. Slamming the door in their faces? Not advised. Bad harvests were blamed on worse manners. The songs themselves varied. Some were about the nativity, others about saints, and many were just about drinking. One popular favourite was "Bring Us in Good Ale," which has a chorus that, shocker, requests good ale. Another classic, "The Boar's Head Carol," sung as a roasted pig's head, was triumphantly carried into the hall like a meaty trophy. So, while modern caroling is a quaint nod to tradition, medieval caroling was part community ritual, part bar crawl, part low-grade shakedown. And it wasn't limited to the 12 days of Christmas. It often stretched well into January, depending on how much beer people still had. Before scented candles and electric fireplaces, there was the Yule log, a hunk of real, unapologetically massive timber dragged into the hall and set ablaze with almost religious ceremony. In fact, the log was so large that medieval houses often had to leave part of it sticking out of the hearth. They'd just shove it in further as it burned, like a flaming breadstick of seasonal joy. This wasn't just about staying warm. The Yule log had deep symbolic roots, many of them suspiciously pagan. It was believed to ward off evil spirits, bring good luck, and even predict the future based on how the flames flickered. The ashes were often saved and spread on fields for fertility, or kept in the home to protect against lightning strikes. Yes, lightning. Medieval logic was part magic, part superstition, and 100% committed. Lighting the log was a big deal. Often they used embers from the previous year's Yule log, a tradition that symbolized continuity, prosperity, and, let's be honest, fire safety anxiety. To light it with new fire was bad luck, like hitting shuffle on your family's Destiny playlist. You wanted that slow, familiar burn. The log itself was chosen with care. Sometimes a whole tree was selected in advance and chopped down specifically for the occasion. Wealthy households might decorate it with ribbons, greenery, or even dust it with wine. It was meant to last all 12 nights of Christmas, and if it went out too early, uh-oh, bad omen. Hope you didn't like your livestock too much. Gathering around the Yule log was a social event. People would drink, sing, tell stories, and roast chestnuts. It turned the hearth into the literal and metaphorical centre of Christmas life. Kids were told tales of what might crawl down the chimney if they misbehaved, while adults passed around mugs of wassail and swapped gossip with a side of pork. Though the Yule log tradition has mostly vanished, except in cake form, it once symbolised warmth, community, and the magical suspension of rules that Christmas brought. It was, in short, the medieval version of Netflix and a crackling fireplace, but with fewer marshmallows and more goats. When it comes to Christmas presents, medieval folks would be confused by wrapping paper, boughs, and Amazon wish lists. Gift-giving did exist, but it wasn't the central event it is today, and it certainly wasn't on Christmas Day. That honour usually went to New Year's Day or Epiphany, January 6th, depending on local custom and which saint you were trying to impress, and forget the one big present idea. Gifts tended to be symbolic rather than extravagant. A noble might gift a falcon or a book. A servant might receive gloves, food, or, if they were lucky, a coin. Children might get nuts, apples, or if someone was feeling generous, a toy carved from wood. Gold-plated Xbox? Not quite. But hey, nothing says I love you like a handful of walnuts. Games, however, were another story. The medieval 12 days of Christmas were practically invented for rowdy entertainment, ranging from dice and card games to full-blown outdoor sports that usually ended with someone in a ditch. Hoodman Blind, a version of Blind Man's Bluff. Hot cockles, which involved blindfolds and slapping, don't ask. And wrestling matches were common. If it involved competition, mild violence, or theatrical flair, it made the holiday cut. Board games also had their place. Chess was popular among the nobility, as was alquerque, a precursor to checkers. But even these were often played with a heavy mug of ale nearby, which is probably why medieval chessboards were found under tables more often than on them. For those more inclined to theatricality, there were mummers' plays, masked performances put on by roving groups of amateur actors. These were chaotic, semi-improvised dramas often involving themes of death and resurrection, dragons, saints, and the occasional dancing devil. Think medieval soap opera with a script written by your drunk uncle, and let's not forget charades, riddles, and riddling contests, a favourite pastime in noble courts. Losers might have to chug ale, recite an embarrassing poem, or wear something ridiculous, like a pig snout tied to their nose with string, which, to be fair, still sounds better than most office secret Santas. So while medieval Christmas gifts were modest, the spirit of play and mischief made the season rich in other ways. It was a time when laughter and games had their rightful place next to prayer and roast swan, and often got a bit more attention. Amidst all the drunken wassailing, roasted boars, and men in goat costumes declaring themselves kings for a day, there was still the matter of the birth of Christ, which was, technically, the whole reason for the season. In the medieval world, Christmas was both holy day and holiday, and few things captured the sacred side more than midnight mass. At the stroke of midnight on December 25th, villagers, nobles and monks would bundle up and trudge through the cold, often through snow and mud, to attend a solemn, candle-lit service. The church bells would ring, echoing over thatched rooftops and frosted fields. Inside, the church was transformed, filled with incense, flickering candles, and evergreen branches woven into garlands. If you were lucky, a choir might chant in Latin. If you were really lucky, the choir boys wouldn't be hungover from sneaking ale the night before. Midnight Mass was one of 3 masses celebrated that day. Yes, 3. The first at midnight symbolised Christ's eternal birth from the Father. The second, at dawn, represented his birth from the Virgin Mary. The third, in broad daylight, celebrated his birth into the hearts of believers. In short, triple the symbolism, triple the sitting on cold stone benches. These services were not quick affairs. Gregorian chants, processions, readings in Latin, and for the illiterate masses, that meant a lot of standing, nodding solemnly, and trying to figure out which saint they were supposed to be focusing on. Still, it was a major communal event. Even peasants who rarely saw the inside of a church might show up for Christmas Mass, if only to feel connected to something divine between ale-fueled revelries. Churches often staged nativity plays, complete with Mary, Joseph, angels, shepherds, and sometimes a real baby, or a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, depending on availability and baby willingness. These plays were meant to be reverent, but often ended up with comic relief, a tradition that continues to this day every time someone forgets their line or a sheep escapes. In a world where life was unpredictable, brutal and short, Christmas Mass offered something transcendent, a moment of peace, awe and light in the darkest part of the year. It was the anchor that held the chaos together. That, and maybe one last round of mulled wine. After 12 days of feasting, singing, drinking, and institutionalized absurdity, the medieval Christmas season ended with a final bang. The Feast of the Epiphany, celebrated on January 6th. It marked the arrival of the 3 Magi, or wise men, who came bearing gifts for the newborn Christ. For medieval folks, it also marked the moment when you had to stop pretending that eating swan in your underwear while watching mummers perform was normal behaviour. Epiphany was a major feast day, nearly as significant as Christmas itself. The churches pulled out all the stops: incense, processions, chanting, symbolic offerings, and in some regions, blessing the water and homes with holy chalk to protect against evil. It was the last sacred hurrah before the long, cold slog of ordinary life resumed. But don't worry, the chaos hadn't fully burned itself out yet. In many places, Epiphany featured the Twelfth Night celebrations, which were the most raucous of all. There was music, masking, gift-giving, and sometimes full-on theatrical madness. A king and queen of the bean were crowned, chosen by who found a dried bean or pea hidden inside a cake. The lucky finder got to rule the feast, boss people around, and wear a paper crown. It was part satire, part social catharsis, and part excuse to yell, "All hail the pea queen." The food on Epiphany was as grand as ever. Roast meats, pies, and especially the 12th cake, ancestor to today's king cake, usually filled with dried fruit, sugar, and a few questionable surprises. At this point, everyone was bloated, possibly hungover, and vaguely aware that Lent would eventually ruin everything. For children, Epiphany was sometimes the day for receiving gifts, a reflection of the Magi bringing gold, frankincense, and myrrh. For adults, it was the last socially acceptable day to flirt with a jester or wear a devil mask to church. And when the feast was over, the decorations came down, the Yule log was extinguished, its ashes often kept for good luck, and people returned to their usual lives of toil, prayer, and trying not to die of dysentery. The medieval Christmas season was over. 12 days of inverted order, holy reverence, drunken misrule, and communal joy, gone until next year. But what a ride it was. Before Christmas, before Yule logs and gingerbread men, there was Saturnalia, the Roman festival so rowdy and upside down that it makes modern holiday office parties look like silent prayer. Held in honour of Saturn, the god of agriculture, time and generations, Saturnalia was a festival of reversal, chaos and celebration, and it all began on December 17th. In theory, Saturnalia started as a simple religious observance. The temple of Saturn on the Capitoline Hill was the central stage. Priests offered sacrifices, unveiled the statue of Saturn, which was usually bound in wool, and let the god run free. But by the time the Republic gave way to empire, the ritual had exploded into a citywide week of licensed misbehaviour. Shops and schools closed, public business ground to a halt. Courts refused to hear cases. Even the Senate found more excuses than usual not to show up. No wars were declared, no battles fought. For once the Roman machine paused, and everyone took a deep breath, before diving headfirst into drunken feasting, dice games, and cross-dressing. And here's the fun part. The Romans loved role reversals. Masters served slaves, senators wore silly hats. Everyone swapped their togas for colourful leisure wear called synthesis, basically ancient party robes. Even the usually rigid Roman class system got a temporary makeover. Freedmen mocked their patrons. Women played men in street skits. Slaves sat at banquets while their owners waited on them, all while pretending the world had always been this way. This wasn't just tolerated. It was ritualized chaos, sanctioned by the gods themselves. Homes and public buildings were decorated with garlands, wreaths, and candles. There were no solemn hymns, only laughter, music, and the clatter of dice rolling on marble. People gave gifts, wax figurines, gag presents, and small tokens called sigillaria, the Roman equivalent of Secret Santa gone rogue. Saturnalia wasn't merely indulgent. It was Rome's way of pressing pause on the imperial rat race and letting people breathe, eat, gamble, mock the rich, and pretend, just for a few days, that time belonged to Saturn, not Caesar. If you were a Roman slave, there was one time of year when you could finally kick your feet up, sip some wine, and bark orders at your master without fear of being flogged. That time was Saturnalia. During this wild week of role reversal, the social order was flipped on its head, and no tradition captured that better than the moment masters served their slaves. It wasn't just symbolic. This was a full-blown, ritualized inversion of power. Slaves could dress like free citizens, speak freely, crack jokes at their owner's expense, and even dine at the same table, or, in many households, at the head of it. Meanwhile, their masters were expected to serve them food and wine, play the fool, and generally pretend they didn't run the empire the other 358 days of the year. Some households took it further, holding mock elections to name a king of Saturnalia, often chosen from among the slaves. This temporary monarch had the power to command ridiculous tasks. Sing a song about a goat. Drink 3 cups of wine while standing on one leg. Think of it as a cross between a jester and a dictator, except with more garlands and fewer consequences. Was it all in good fun? Yes. But it was also deeply political and cathartic. In a society built on inequality, Saturnalia offered a rare moment for the powerless to push back, even if only in jest. For slaves, this wasn't just entertainment. It was relief, a temporary break in the grinding monotony of servitude. For masters, it was a reminder that their power was not divine. It was tolerated, fragile, and maybe a little ridiculous when viewed from the bottom up. Of course, the illusion didn't last. After the festival ended, the roles snapped back like a cruel rubber band. But for those few days, laughter replaced commands. Satire replaced fear, and Rome, for all its grandeur, remembered what it was like to let go of control and to laugh at itself. It was, in a way, Rome's pressure valve, a moment of ritualized rebellion that made the strict order of daily life slightly more bearable. If there was ever a time in Rome to break the rules, loudly and with wine-stained tunics, it was Saturnalia. Gambling, normally frowned upon in polite society, became not only acceptable, but expected. Men, women, and even children grabbed dice or knucklebones and bet coins, food or ridiculous dares. Even slaves, who were usually banned from betting altogether, joined in on the action, and sometimes even cleaned out their masters' purses. Taverns overflowed, private homes became mini-casinos, and the clatter of dice on marble floors was practically the background music of the season. Roman dice games weren't just about luck, they were about rebellion. Playing them openly during Saturnalia was like publicly declaring, "For this 1 week I answer to no one, not even Jupiter." And of course, no Roman festival would be complete without enough alcohol to float a galley. Wine flowed freely, often mixed with honey, spices or herbs, which made it taste more like medicine, but also like something that needed to be consumed in bulk. There were no toasts to moderation. People drank to Saturn, to freedom, to each other, and often to the ceiling. Drunken singing in the streets? Absolutely. Public dancing? Yes. Wearing wreaths made of ivy and stumbling into a fountain? Practically encouraged. Saturnalia gave Romans an excuse to behave like the exact opposite of their usual stoic, virtue-obsessed selves. Respectable citizens wore bright robes instead of white togas. Senators played the lyre badly in public. Women told dirty jokes and were applauded for it. Chastity, seriousness, and control were tossed out the window with the same enthusiasm as yesterday's bread crusts. Some even called Saturnalia the best of days, because it allowed people to be their truest selves, messy, loud, emotional, and slightly off-key. The wild behaviour wasn't seen as sinful, it was seen as necessary. Just as the earth needed to be tilled and let rest, so too did the Roman spirit. And for that 1 week, it was perfectly acceptable to be irresponsible, gloriously, unapologetically irresponsible. After all, what was the worst that could happen? You'd just go back to being a respectable citizen next week. At the heart of the Saturnalia madness was a crowned fool with too much power and not enough sense, the king of Saturnalia. Sometimes called the Lord of Misrule, this temporary monarch was chosen, often from the lowest social ranks or even a slave, to preside over the festivities like a drunken god in a laurel wreath. The role? Simple. Command chaos. Once crowned, the king could issue ridiculous, often humiliating orders, and everyone was expected to obey. Dance like a donkey. Sing a love song to that fruit bowl. Recite Cicero while hiccuping. Guests at the feast had to follow through, or else risk being laughed off the couch. This wasn't just a gag, it was ritualized subversion. The king was meant to embody the spirit of Saturn himself. Freedom, fertility, disorder. By putting the least powerful person in charge, Romans symbolically overturned their strict social order. The master became servant, and the fool became sovereign, just for a little while. And in that topsy-turvy kingdom, the laws of dignity did not apply. The choice of king was often made by hiding a bean or coin inside a cake. Whoever bit into it became royalty for the night. This tradition would later echo through Europe as the king cake custom during Epiphany and other winter feasts. But the Romans weren't thinking about Christian holidays. They were thinking about who looked funniest in a crown made of vines. Sometimes the role carried a darker tone. In earlier centuries, it may have been tied to older grim fertility rites, where the mock king might actually be sacrificed at the end of his reign. Thankfully, by the imperial period, the worst fate awaiting the king of Saturnalia was a pounding hangover and some very embarrassing stories. And when the festival ended, so did the king's reign. The fool took off his crown, the servants went back to serving, and the absurdity faded into memory, leaving behind only laughter, leftover wine, and perhaps a slightly bruised ego. Still, for that brief moment, a slave could command a senator, and all of Rome would cheer. If you thought giving socks for Christmas was disappointing, try receiving a wax figurine shaped like a turnip. Welcome to Saturnalia gift-giving, where the presents were cheap, funny, and absolutely overflowing with chaotic charm. Unlike the lavish gift-giving of today, Saturnalia gifts, called sigillaria, were small, personal, and often downright silly. These were little wax or clay figurines, joke items, trinkets, or even edible goodies like nuts, dates, and pastries. Some gifts were meant to flatter, others were designed to mock, and a few were clearly last-minute grabs from the nearest market stall. It wasn't about extravagance, it was about symbolism and sentiment. The gift said, "I acknowledge you, I celebrate with you, and here's a tiny wooden phallus for luck." Yes, phallic charms were popular Saturnalia gifts, believed to bring fertility, protection, and laughter. Probably not safe for your office's secret Santa. Romans loved gifting candles too, symbolizing light returning after the darkest days of the year. Think of them as the ancient version of seasonal affective disorder lamps. And handwritten verses or witty jokes were also common, making this the one time of year when being a sarcastic poet actually paid off. Children, of course, loved Saturnalia. It was one of the rare times they were not only indulged with sweets and toys, but also allowed to participate fully in adult festivities, gambling, joking, even bossing their elders around for fun. For a Roman kid, this was basically winning the cultural lottery. But just because the gifts were modest didn't mean they weren't meaningful. A thoughtful sigillarium could reflect your relationship, your sense of humour, or how much wine you'd already had when you picked it out. Some aristocrats even used it as an excuse to hand out favours or cash to clients, a gesture of generosity disguised as tradition. Gift-giving usually happened on or around December 19th, during the height of the celebrations, and much like today, it came with stress, expectations, and the occasional passive-aggressive response. "Oh, another walnut figurine. How original." So next time you're stressing over holiday shopping, remember, the Romans kept it simple. 1 week of jokes, trinkets, and phallic candles, and nobody asked for a gift receipt. If Saturnalia had a dress code, it was do the opposite of what you normally would. In a culture obsessed with dignity, tradition, and clean togas, this was the week when everyone threw on party robes, messed up their hair, and wrapped themselves in ivy. Literally. Forget crisp white togas. During Saturnalia, Romans wore the synthesis, a colourful, informal robe, usually reserved for dining at home. It was like showing up to a black tie gala in a bathrobe, and everyone clapped. Paired with a pileus, a floppy cone-shaped cap symbolising freedom. This outfit was the ancient equivalent of holiday pyjamas and a Santa hat. The decor matched the mood. Homes, temples, and even shop fronts were covered in garlands, greenery, candles, and hanging wreaths. Evergreen branches symbolised life in the darkest days of winter. Ivy and holly, yes, the same stuff we use now, made appearances. Saturnalia wasn't just wild, it was surprisingly aesthetic. But while everything looked festive, there was an undercurrent of mischief. Romans took this opportunity to gently, or not so gently, mock the gods, the Senate, and each other. Sacred symbols were parodied. Processions featured men dressed as Jupiter or Bacchus, behaving like drunken fools. One Saturnalia even saw a mock triumph parade featuring a donkey wearing a laurel crown. Why? Because Saturn said so. Even religion got flipped on its head. Saturn's statue, usually bound in woolen cords to symbolize restraint, was symbolically freed during the festival. He was released from his bindings, just as the people were released from theirs, from work, from roles, from from the usual grind of Roman life. And let's not forget the songs and chants, which filled the streets with equal parts joy and mild blasphemy. Saturnalia tunes ranged from silly drinking chants to bawdy parodies of traditional hymns. Think caroling, but with more wine and less theology. It was, in essence, a holy festival of unholiness. For 1 week, order was mocked, rules were relaxed, and everyone played pretend, not to tear society down, but to remind themselves that life didn't always have to be serious. Even in the heart of the Roman Empire, joy had a place. It's easy to look at Saturnalia and see nothing but drunken dice games and toga-based karaoke. But beneath the chaos, there were ancient, sacred roots, and they were surprisingly serious. Saturnalia wasn't invented by the Romans just to party. It evolved from deep agricultural and religious traditions tied to Saturn, one of Rome's oldest and most complex gods. Saturn was more than just the god of farming. He represented a mythical golden age, a time when humanity lived in peace, equality, and plenty. There were no kings, no slaves, no wars, just free people farming fertile land under a just and generous deity. In that version of history, Saturn ruled with wisdom, and the world was fair. By the time Rome built the Temple of Saturn in the Forum in 497 BCE, the Golden Age was long gone, but people still longed for it. So once a year they tried to bring it back. Saturnalia was a ritual reenactment of that perfect past. For 1 week, hierarchy was suspended, wealth was shared, and laughter replaced law. It wasn't just about mischief, it was spiritual nostalgia. The festival always began with a sacrifice at Saturn's temple, followed by a public banquet in front of it. Anyone could join, regardless of status. Priests unveiled Saturn's statue, unbinding the woolen ropes that normally restrained it all year. This act of freeing the god symbolized the loosening of cosmic and social order, and served as the divine permission slip to go absolutely feral for the next 7 days. Even the date was significant. Late December marked the winter solstice, the darkest time of the year. Saturnalia welcomed the sun's return with light, fire, greenery, and joy. The candles that Romans gifted each other weren't just practical, they were symbols of hope and rebirth. So while Saturnalia may have looked like an excuse to get drunk in public and shout at statues, it was also a sacred reminder. A glimpse, fleeting and chaotic, of the world as it once was, or might be again. A world without class, without oppression, where freedom reigned and the gods walked among the people. When early Christians started carving out space for their own winter holiday, they faced a problem. Saturnalia was incredibly popular. You can try preaching humility and spiritual rebirth all you want, but if the neighbours are across the street wearing ivy crowns, gambling, and handing out nuts, people might start rethinking their weekend plans. So what did the church do? It borrowed liberally. While Saturnalia was gradually phased out as the empire Christianized, many of its traditions didn't die, they just rebranded. The date of Christmas, set on December 25th, conveniently overlaps with the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which itself followed right on the heels of Saturnalia. Whether by coincidence or strategy, the timing aligned perfectly. And with that timing came some carryovers. Gift-giving, Saturnalia, decorating with greenery and candles, Saturnalia, wearing silly hats and reversing roles in pageants, Saturnalia again. Even the boisterous communal feasting found its way into medieval Christmas celebrations, minus the public nudity most of the time. In fact, some early Christian leaders were furious about the overlap. They condemned believers for treating Christ's birth like a pagan party. St. Augustine famously warned against Christians celebrating with drunkenness and dancing. Spoiler alert, nobody listened. By the Middle Ages, elements of Saturnalia had merged seamlessly into Christmas customs. The Lord of Misrule in English Christmas, a direct descendant of the Saturnalia king, the Twelfth Night revelry, straight out of Roman winter feasts, and the tradition of exchanging gifts on or around Christmas was deeply rooted in the old Roman practice of handing out sigillaria during the festival. Even today, Some Saturnalia echoes still linger, in the chaotic family dinners, the laughter, the feeling of time off, and the idea that for a short while we all deserve joy and a bit of disorder. When the final dice clattered across the marble floor, the last goblet of wine was drained, and the king of Saturnalia stumbled off his makeshift throne, the Roman world faced a sobering truth. Saturnalia was over. As quickly as the chaos had begun, order snapped back into place. Masters reclaimed their authority, slaves returned to their stations, togas replaced the colourful synthesis robes, and Roman seriousness returned like a parent turning the lights on at a teenager's party. It was a jarring transition. The week had allowed everyone, from senators to slaves, to revel in freedom, mock power, and live without consequence. But Rome, for all its decadence, thrived on structure, and Saturnalia was never meant to destroy that structure, only to release the pressure that built beneath it. Like steam from a bathhouse, it had to be let out before the walls cracked. The end of Saturnalia also marked the symbolic return of Saturn to his bindings. The god's statue at the temple was once again tied with woolen cords, representing the re-establishment of discipline, control, and cosmic order. The Golden Age was packed up like a party decoration, not gone, but definitely postponed for another year. For the average Roman, the aftermath came with a hangover, literal or spiritual. Some returned to their routines reluctantly, nursing sore heads and emptier purses after too many wagers. Others seemed relieved, eager to restore social roles that had temporarily dissolved. And for slaves, Saturnalia was bittersweet, a rare taste of dignity and joy, followed by the return to chains. Writers like Seneca noted the excesses, while others, like Macrobius, documented the deeper meanings. They knew Saturnalia was more than indulgence. It was a reflection of Rome's strange genius, the ability to uphold authority while mocking it, to rule an empire while giving it 1 week to act like a drunken toddler. And yet, Saturnalia never truly vanished. Even after the rise of Christianity and the fall of the Western Empire, its spirit lingered, evolving, blending, transforming into the very DNA of our modern winter holidays. Because every civilization, no matter how disciplined, needs a little chaos. And every calendar, no matter how strict, needs a week when the world turns upside down and laughs at itself. In the medieval world, there was no doctor waiting on horseback, no hospital wing ready with warm linens. When a woman went into labour, whether in a peasant's hovel or a noblewoman's chamber, it was the midwife who was called, often in the middle of the night, often with little notice, and almost always with life or death stakes. The midwife wasn't licensed, rarely educated in the formal sense, and almost never paid what she was worth. But in the eyes of her community, she was vital. Without her, birth was not only painful, it was lethal. In some villages, she might be the only person with any experience in childbirth, and even the parish priest wouldn't question her presence when the screams began. She carried no diploma, just a satchel of herbs, oils, linens, and hard-earned experience. Her training came from other women, older midwives, family members, or sheer repetition. She might have started as an assistant, passing cloths and holding hands, learning when to wait and when to act. Her classroom was the birthing mat, her textbook, blood and breath. Her days were full of contradictions. She was both honoured and feared, welcomed into homes during sacred moments, and then pushed to the margins when suspicions rose. A healthy baby and mother meant celebration, a stillbirth or hemorrhage. That could turn her from healer to suspect. People in the 1200s to 1400s didn't understand germs or uterine rupture, but they did understand blame. And if a woman died, someone had to carry it. Still, the midwife endured. She navigated superstition as deftly as she handled breech births. A charm against the evil eye here, a whispered prayer to St. Margaret there. She might draw a protective circle with chalk, or place a knife under the bed to ward off spirits. She didn't believe in magic. Not exactly. But she did believe in anything that might help. She was always on call. No rest, no luxury. Just urgency, sweat, and the quiet pressure of being the first to touch a life, or the last to see it leave. And yet, she was never the story's heroine. She was its anchor, uncredited but unshakable. There were no textbooks, no classrooms, and certainly no medical diplomas waiting at the end. To become a midwife in the 13th or 14th century, a woman learned the craft the same way she might learn to bake bread or mend a roof, by watching, helping, and eventually doing. It was an apprenticeship not of theory, but of lived, often traumatic, experience. Usually, a young girl would begin her training by shadowing an older midwife, a mother, aunt, or respected elder in the village. She started by preparing the birthing room, stoking the fire, boiling water, laying out clean cloths. Then she watched. Not from the back of the room, but up close, watching a woman groan and sweat and scream as new life tore its way into the world. It wasn't sanitized. It was real, loud, bloody, and terrifying. And for many young girls, that was the moment they either committed or turned back forever. If she stayed, she would soon be helping directly, cleaning the baby, tying off the cord, applying herbs to the mother's torn flesh. Slowly, under the older midwife's guidance, she'd learned to recognize danger, the way a mother's breath changed before she fainted from blood loss, or the ominous silence that meant a baby hadn't taken its first breath. It was an oral tradition. Nothing was written down, especially not in Latin, which most women couldn't read anyway. Midwives passed knowledge like folklore, wrapped in stories, warnings, and superstitions. Don't cut the cord before the afterbirth comes, one might say. Put rosemary under her pillow to keep the devil away. Every piece of advice came from somewhere, and often it worked. Her first solo birth would be a baptism by fire. If the mother lived, if the baby cried, if the bleeding stopped, only then would she start to earn trust. And it wasn't just about technique. A midwife needed nerve, compassion, and the ability to stay calm while others panicked. She didn't have the luxury of uncertainty. By the time she was accepted by the village, she would already have held life in one hand and death in the other. And still, she would show up at the next birth, with chapped hands, aching joints, and eyes that had already seen too much. A medieval midwife didn't have scalpels, forceps, or antiseptic, but that didn't mean she came empty-handed. Her toolkit was humble, improvised, and carried with the quiet confidence of someone who'd used it 100 times before. It was a mix of natural remedies, superstitious protections, and hard-earned instinct. First came the herbs, the midwife's version of a medicine cabinet. She knew which ones could ease pain, which could stop bleeding, and which could coax a reluctant uterus into action. Pennyroyal, mugwort, yarrow, and shepherd's purse were among her favourites. Boiled into teas, ground into poultices, or burned for their aroma, each plant had its place. Some were genuinely effective, others more symbolic, but they were all part of the ritual. She carried swaddling cloths, often soaked in vinegar or wine to disinfect. Not that anyone in the 13th century understood bacteria, but they had noticed that wine seemed to help. She also brought oil, usually olive or almond, to massage the mother's belly or ease tearing. A small, sharp knife or pair of shears was used to cut the cord, and if the child wasn't breathing, the midwife might suck mucus from its nose or swing it gently to stimulate a cry. Then there were the charms and talismans. Not everyone approved, especially the church, but most women preferred to hedge their bets. A small carved image of St. Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth, might be placed near the bed. Some midwives wore protective amulets around their necks. Others etched crosses into the lintel, or slipped iron needles into the straw mattress to keep evil spirits at bay. Midwives also relied on positioning and touch. They learned how to feel the baby's position through the belly, how to turn a breech child by hand, and how to reposition a labouring woman to relieve pressure or restart a stalled birth. There were no fetal monitors, no ultrasounds, just intuition, observation, and deep physical familiarity with the female body. In the face of blood, fear, and screaming pain, the medieval midwife had only what she could carry, and what she had carried in her memory. That was enough. Childbirth in the medieval world was not a gentle affair. It was loud, painful, unpredictable, and far more dangerous than most people today can imagine. The midwife stood at the centre of this storm, not as a doctor in control, but as a witness and guide, trying to steer two lives through a needle's eye with nothing more than her hands and her resolve. Medieval births often took place in dimly lit, smoky rooms, sometimes with a fire roaring and windows shuttered to keep out evil spirits. Women gave birth not lying down, but squatting or sitting on a birthing stool, surrounded by female relatives, neighbours, and perhaps a servant or two. Men were usually banished. The space belonged to women, and the midwife ruled it like a quiet queen. The midwife watched for signs, the way the woman breathed, how the belly shifted, the look in her eyes when the pain changed from early contractions to something deeper. She knew how to listen for silence. Silence could mean the baby was stuck, or the mother was bleeding too much. She moved quickly but calmly, issuing orders in a firm tone, her fingers always working. When things went well, the child came cleanly. The mother's tears turned to laughter, and the room filled with relief. But often, the midwife had to act fast. A hemorrhage meant stuffing clean rags, or even her own hand into the womb. A baby not breathing? She'd try rubbing, warming, swinging, even breathing into its mouth, not from science, but from tradition and desperation. Stillbirths and maternal deaths were common. When they happened, the midwife didn't cry. She cleaned the mother's body, wrapped the child, and said a prayer. If the baby was dying and not yet baptized, she'd perform an emergency baptism herself, often using wine or even saliva if no holy water was on hand. That one act, forbidden by the church but widely practiced, might save a soul in the eyes of the grieving. Midwives were not miracle workers, but they fought like warriors. Against pain, against blood loss, against the shadow of death hanging just outside the cottage door. And sometimes they won. And that was enough to keep going. In the Middle Ages, the line between life and death was razor thin, and nowhere was it more visible than in the hands of the midwife. She didn't just deliver babies. She sometimes baptized them too, and that put her in a strange and delicate position. Part healer, part spiritual gatekeeper, part scapegoat. The church taught that unbaptized babies couldn't enter heaven. They were doomed to limbo, not punished, but forever cut off from divine light. In towns where a priest might be several miles away, or unreachable during a long winter night, the midwife was the only one present to act. And so, if a baby emerged blue or not breathing, she would sprinkle wine, water, or even her own spit on the child's head, and murmur the sacred words, "I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." Technically, this wasn't allowed. Baptism was a priest's job. But practically, everyone looked the other way. It was better to save a soul than follow every rule. Still, the midwife's actions came at a price. If the baby died, baptized or not, and especially if the mother also passed, suspicion often followed. People might whisper, did she use the wrong herbs? Did she delay the birth? Was she in league with darker forces? The line between folk knowledge and witchcraft was as blurry as the boundaries of theology. And because midwives used herbal remedies, incantations, and charms that weren't always sanctioned by the church, they were vulnerable to accusations. A woman who had saved dozens of lives could be turned into a suspect by a single bad outcome. Worse, if the baptism failed, or wasn't performed at all, the grief of the family could curdle into rage. The midwife might be banned, punished, or even reported to local authorities. For many women in her role, especially in towns where superstition ran hot, just doing her job could put her at risk. And yet she continued. Because while everyone else panicked over theology, the midwife knew what really mattered: the scream of a living child, the rise and fall of a mother's chest, and the simple, sacred relief of another soul safely born. The medieval midwife lived in a constant balancing act, not just between life and death, but between faith and suspicion. On one side stood the church, with its priests, rituals, and male-dominated hierarchy. On the other stood the midwife's folk knowledge, herbal lore, and the quiet power of women's community wisdom. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter, never written, always watched. The church had mixed feelings about midwives. They were necessary, yes. No male priest was going to deliver a baby in a peasant's hut. But they were also feared. Why? Because they operated outside the church's direct control. They handled births alone. They made decisions about baptism. They whispered prayers that weren't always Latin. Some clerics tried to bring midwives under official sanction. In some dioceses, they were forced to take oaths, promising never to use magic, never to perform abortion, and never to speak blasphemy in the birthing room. Others were interrogated or denied communion if there were rumours, or simply if a baby died on their watch. Yet most midwives weren't heretics or witches. They were practical women trying to help mothers survive childbirth with the tools they had. Yes, they knew about herbs that could end a pregnancy, or salves that soothed fevers, but they weren't stirring cauldrons in the woods at midnight. They were boiling water in kitchens, tying cords with trembling hands, and facing the screams of labour alone. That didn't stop accusations. In the later 14th century, especially as Europe entered the pre-Reformation period, fear of witches began to rise, and midwives, with their hands-on knowledge of the female body, became easy targets. Some were blamed for miscarriages, deformities, even infertility. If a birth went wrong, people asked, was it the mother's sin, or did the midwife let the devil in? The irony. The very practices that kept women alive, herbal remedies, quiet chants, protective charms, were the same ones that might get her branded a witch. So the midwife walked a careful line. She crossed herself before placing a charm, mentioned saints while mixing herbs, and made sure every act of healing looked like a prayer. She wasn't just delivering babies. She was delivering herself from suspicion, every single time. In an age when women were mostly confined to the background, the birthing room was one of the few places they truly ruled. No men allowed, unless things went catastrophically wrong. Here, in the tight, sweaty confines of a peasant's home or a noblewoman's chamber, the midwife presided over a world built by women for women, and it was held together by pain, prayer, and the power of companionship. Birth was not a solitary experience. Women gave birth surrounded by a birthing circle, a trusted group of female neighbours, a sister, an aunt, maybe even the local alewife or healer. These women weren't there just to watch. They helped hold the mother up, massaged her back, brought hot cloths, whispered encouragement, and sang old songs, lullabies meant for unborn ears. At the centre of it all stood the midwife, directing, guiding, commanding with quiet authority. She wasn't always gentle. Sometimes she had to shout over screams, slap a face to bring a woman back from panic, or bark orders for more hot water. But she also knew how to soothe with a glance, a story, or a worn-down charm passed from hand to hand. This circle of women was more than practical. It was spiritual armour. Labour was dangerous. It could kill. So the presence of familiar, trusted faces helped the labouring mother stay grounded. Midwives sometimes led group prayers or chants, or even staged rituals of protection, binding a ribbon around the mother's wrist, lighting candles to the Virgin, or pouring wine onto the earth to appease whatever spirits might be lurking nearby. And when the baby finally arrived, wet, wailing, alive, it wasn't just the mother who rejoiced. The whole circle cheered, wept, and crossed themselves. There was laughter, relief, maybe even bread and ale passed around if things had gone well. In a world that rarely offered women control, the birthing room was a rare realm of female power. And the midwife was its guardian, not just of the baby, but of the bonds between women, woven through centuries of shared knowledge, whispered secrets, and fierce love. Being a medieval midwife wasn't a calling born of wealth. It was grueling, thankless, and often unpaid, or at best, compensated in bread, chickens, or promises. And yet, for many women, it was one of the few respectable ways to gain status, purpose, and a modest livelihood in a society that offered them almost none. Most midwives were not part of the nobility. They were peasant women, tradeswomen, or widows who had built up reputations over years of service. In cities, some gained local fame, even being appointed as official parish midwives. But in villages, they were often treated as half-healers, half-helpers, expected to serve whenever summoned. Payment, when it came, was inconsistent. In wealthier towns, some women received small sums of coin or gifts of wine, wool, or candles. But more often, payment was a promise. We'll give you a chicken at harvest, or you'll get bread from the next bake. And if the child or mother died, that promise could vanish, or worse, turn into accusations or cold silence. Despite this, a good midwife could build a quiet kind of power. She was respected, feared, needed. Women trusted her more than any priest, especially when the pain of childbirth hit and no male authority could offer comfort. Over time, if she avoided scandal and built a record of successful births, she became part of the village fabric, the one women whispered about with awe, the one they called even before their labour started. Some cities, particularly by the late 1300s, began to formalise midwifery. In places like France and parts of Germany, midwives were occasionally examined or licensed by male physicians or clerics, a dubious mix of medicine and moral policing. But even then they were rarely paid well. The status was symbolic, the risk very real. And yet, despite the exhaustion, the irregular income, and the suspicion that always lingered nearby, the midwife remained. She didn't do it for coin. She did it because no one else would, or could, and because each healthy birth, each baby's first cry, was a small sacred victory that belonged to her and no one else. The life of a medieval midwife rarely ended with accolades or gravestones. No statues were carved in her honour. No books bore her name. Yet for hundreds of years she was the quiet guardian of life, guiding generations into the world with her worn hands and weathered wisdom, and disappearing just as quietly when her work was done. Many midwives died poor and anonymous, with no formal training, no titles, and often no surviving family. Their stories faded unless preserved in parish records, court documents, or whispers. Some were buried with gratitude, their herbs and tools passed on to apprentices. Others were forgotten, or worse, remembered only if they were accused of wrongdoing during their final years. Yet their impact rippled silently through history. Every woman who survived childbirth in a mud-floor cottage or cold stone hall owed her life to one of these women. Every healthy baby placed into swaddling cloths had first felt the hands of a midwife, hands that had already delivered dozens, perhaps hundreds before. Their knowledge, even without books, persisted. It passed through generations like folklore, which herbs to use, which prayers to whisper, which positions to try when labour stalled. The church may have tried to control them, physicians may have dismissed them, but women remembered, mothers remembered, and so their legacy lived through lineage, not letters. By the 15th century, formal medicine began to tighten its grip. Male physicians entered the birthing room. Midwifery, once the sole domain of women, was gradually redefined by men with degrees and Latin diagnoses. Many midwives were pushed aside, sometimes literally, sometimes by law, and in the centuries to come, the midwife would become a figure both romanticised and erased. But in the 1200s to 1400s, she was still the centre of the storm. She walked through the blood and fear, the superstition and screams, and brought new life into the world, not because she was invited by history, but because she was needed by life itself. And even though we don't always know their names, We remember what they did, quietly, repeatedly, bravely,